Well, welcome back, and now we're going to talk about descriptive research. And descriptive research is a little bit different from exploratory research in that it really is concerned more about large groups of people than it is about the opinions of individuals. That's not to say that the opinions of individuals aren't important, but what we use descriptive research for is to describe a population or a sample, in other words, a big group of people, as opposed to trying to understand how a group of people have similar feelings or attitudes towards things, which is a more exploratory approach. So the best way to think about descriptive research is that it's about describing a group, often with statistics, means, standard deviations, modes, frequency counts, frequency percentages, things like that. And as a result, a lot of descriptive research tends to be quantitative, it's numbers oriented, and it also tends to be either primary or secondary. Now, a lot of the descriptive research you're going to hear about in this class is going to be primary because we're going to be working on primary case projects. But secondary research is also a very valuable place to find descriptive data, and particularly in packaged or syndicated data. There's a lot of opportunity to learn about large groups of people much less expensively than conducting primary research. Now, there are several reasons to conduct descriptive research. One of those is to just look at groups of people and to generate statistics that describe them. So we might say, for example, within this class, 70% of the students are A students, and 20% are B students, and 10% are C students. Hopefully the distribution is even a little bit more skewed than that towards A students, but those would be the statistics to talk about the class. We might say that 52% of the class is male and 48% is female. We might say that 60% are juniors and 40% are seniors. These are all just ways of talking about the group. But we might also want to compare those groups. So I might have a hypothesis, for example, that juniors tend to do less well in the class than seniors. Seniors are more serious, they're more motivated, they do better. Or it could be the other way around. I could say that juniors tend to do better because seniors have senioritis and they tend not to study as hard because they're just ready to graduate and get on with their lives. So what I can do with my descriptive research is I can compare those two groups, and I can use some different processes that we're going to learn about in coming weeks to see if those hypotheses are true. And I can also just kind of generally break things down and get a feel for how those groups differ from one another. I can also try to measure things over time, and there are different trends that I might want to look for in data. I might just want to see if satisfaction is going up or down, or if engagement is going up and down. I might specifically want to also conduct monitoring, tracking, or switching studies, which are more specific forms of trend measurement. Monitoring studies might be set in place to look for key symptoms that might trigger a response that there's a problem occurring. Tracking studies might give me some idea of how key variables are performing over time and help me to see if things that I'm hypothesizing are going to go up, like let's say awareness of a product during a heavy advertising campaign, if those two things are varying together. In other words, as we increase advertising spending, is awareness going up? So I could use a tracking study to look for that. Switching studies are often centered around brand switching, and they can be used in many different applications. Some of those applications might include trying to understand what it would take to get people to switch from brand X to brand Y. Other times it might be actually tracking how people are switching over time, maybe as other variables come into play that we're examining or that we're hypothesizing and looking at. We can also use descriptive research to conduct advanced analytics. And this is where the boundaries of this class begin to show, and if you're really interested in these advanced analytics, then you really need to go into a graduate program like the SIUe MMR program, of which I'm a graduate, to learn how to do some of these things. And there's some really cool stuff that you can do with descriptive research. For example, you can use a process called clustering to look at groups of respondents that have similar responses about things. They might not be that similar demographically or psychographically or in some of the more obvious ways, but they might have very similar perspectives on product usage or on intent to purchase or engagement or satisfaction or things like that. And we might be able to break them into target market clusters that are more based on their attitude and their behavior than they are on more traditional breakouts. We can also use a process called factoring, where we can take a large number of variables and we can use a factoring process to distill them down to maybe 3 or 4 key themes, and we can understand after taking a lot of different data from a group of respondents, the big picture ideas of what we've learned. We can also use a process called regression, and regression is a tool that we can use to actually predict the future based on data that we have that's existing. We can also use it to understand the relative importance of variables to one another if we've designed a study with the ability to do that. So there's all kinds of really neat things that you can do with this descriptive data. Like I said, unfortunately, we're not going to cover most of them in this class, but they are available and they are very cool and interesting. The methods of descriptive research tend to center around the word survey. So paper surveys, which you fill out by hand with a pen or a pencil. Online or mobile surveys, which you can fill out on the internet or via your mobile phone, sometimes using text messaging or a mobile website. Telephone surveys, which are often administered by a human being calling someone and taking them through a survey, although they can also be administered by computer systems that walk you through a survey. And then intercept surveys are where human beings stand in a really crowded place and they try to get people within that crowd to take a survey. Sometimes they just hand them a paper survey and let them take it. Other times they actually read the survey and write down the answers themselves and administer it themselves. So these are all common methods of descriptive research, and they all really have in common the idea of getting a lot of data, often in a quantitative fashion, to generate statistics, although they might also have some open-ended questions that are a little bit more qualitative in nature. They're usually analyzed in a more descriptive fashion, where they're being used to talk about how a group feels about things, maybe to look for common words or common vocabulary or common themes, rather than, again, individual opinion, which is really a more exploratory approach. But the idea is that even with that qualitative data, we're really looking for a more quantitative assessment. So there are different styles of surveys that you can administer as well, and 2 keywords that you need to understand are cross-sectional, or I should say key phrases, cross-sectional and longitudinal. And the idea here is really what you're going to do with the data over time. So a cross-sectional survey, let's just imagine for a minute, I'll give you some really silly example. Let's imagine that we want to understand what's inside a hot dog, okay? So there are 2 ways that you can really understand what's inside a hot dog. One of them is that you can buy a pack of hot dogs, and in every hot dog you can cut out a tiny little slice, and you can compare each slice from each of the hot dogs from your pack and try to see if you find any commonalities. And the good thing is that you're making sure that whatever you find is really representative of the entire pack of hot dogs. It's not just what one hot dog has to say about what its contents are. The bad thing is that there could be variation depending on where you cut that slice of hot dog off. If you cut off the end, it might look a little bit different than if you cut from in the middle. If the hot dogs are natural casing, or they're more sausage-like and less the highly processed Oscar Mayer style hot dogs, the ingredients might look a little different as you go. So these cross sections that you're comparing, they're all different. They're all from different places. They should be similar. They should have a very similar story to tell, but because they're each from an individual hot dog, they're a little bit different as well. A longitudinal study, on the other hand, would be about taking several different pieces from one hot dog and comparing them. And in research, the separation between those slices would be time, but in this case it's the length of the hot dog, so we could cut from different lengths of the hot dog and try to understand what's in one hot dog. The problem is that when you do that, you're restricting yourself to understanding just that hot dog, and if you're trying to project out to what the other hot dogs have to say, you have to make an assumption, either based on prior research or based on some logical deductions that may or may not hold up when you go to validate. But the idea, so hopefully my hot dog analogy there didn't throw you, but the idea of a cross-sectional survey and a longitudinal survey is really about how you're going to sample. So with a cross-sectional survey, again, think about it as being, we're drawing samples from different compositions. So if I wanted to sample students that have been through Marketing 377, I could draw a sample from each of the classes that I have taught. And each sample would be unique and different from the others. It wouldn't have any overlap, or generally would have very little overlap. Hopefully we don't have any students that have failed that are taking the class over again or anything like that. But these cross-sectional samples should be independent of each other, and each is going to have its own unique composition compared to the others. And as a result, there's going to be more opportunity for variation between these cross-sectional samples, but there's going to be less opportunity for repetition or for some of the error effects that can be caused by people taking the same survey over and over. A longitudinal survey, on the other hand, would be, let's say that I decided to survey the same students every quarter and ask them about their experiences in the School of Business. So I'd be interviewing the same group of students over and over and over. But I wouldn't be interviewing anybody else. I'd just always interview the same students, and I'd always compare their data to what they'd said in previous quarters when I had drawn data from them. And so the idea here, I know I might be making this a little confusing, but the idea here is that cross-sectional samples are generally made up of different people. They might be the same survey, they might be all taking the same survey, but it's made up of different people every time. So that what I'm comparing is the results of what different groups of people have to say. Whereas with a longitudinal survey, it's always the same people that I'm interviewing, and they may or may not be taking the same exact survey every time, but what I'm comparing is what those same people have to say from survey to survey to survey. Okay? In longitudinal research, we also have two distinctions that we need to understand. One is called a continuous panel, and one is called a discontinuous or omnibus panel. I'll just call it discontinuous for this lecture. So a continuous panel is a group of respondents that we're studying in a longitudinal fashion that get the same survey every time. So let's say I'm interviewing students every semester. Let's just use every semester as an example. So I start off with a group of students that are in my Marketing 377 class, and I continue surveying that group of students even as they go into their careers. And every semester, I give them the same exact survey about what they learned in the School of Business. And I look over time to see if their knowledge has increased and if they feel like the value of their education has increased. I can look over time using that same survey and see if any of those variables change. In a discontinuous survey, I might ask some questions the same, but I might also ask some questions differently. And I might actually focus on different objectives. Like, for example, while they're students, I might ask them more about the curriculum that they're in school. And while they're not students, while they're out in their careers after they've graduated, I might ask them more about the application of what they've learned. So I would be comparing not the same variables over and over and over, but I'd be comparing more their general attitudes towards the School of Business as time goes on. And so, again, you know, continuous and discontinuous panels are forms of longitudinal research, and they relate to whether or not I'm using the same survey over and over and over, that's continuous, or whether I'm using a survey that might change over time with the same group of people, and that's a discontinuous survey. With that said, I hope I haven't confused you too much with all the terminology, but if you remember anything in this lecture, what I want you to remember is that descriptive research is used to talk about a group of people using statistics most of the time. And most of the time, to get that information, we're going to conduct surveys. So if you hear the word survey, you almost always need to think descriptive research.